The air in Croft & Co's Fine Jewels was a quiet symphony of hushed reverence. It smelled of old money, of polished mahogany, and the faint, clean, metallic scent of precious things. Eleanor Vance traced the cool edge of the glass display case, her reflection a pale, elegant ghost against the royal blue velvet within. Sapphires, deep as a twilight sea, winked back at her. It was their 15th anniversary, and the tradition, Richard's tradition, was a significant piece of jewelry for every significant year. "The salon is exquisite, Eleanor," Richard said from his chair, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that had charmed boardrooms and investors for 2 decades. He wasn't looking at the sapphires, however. His gaze was fixed on the glowing screen of his phone, his thumb swiping in a rhythm that had become the background music to their marriage. Unheated. A true investment. Eleanor didn't turn. "An investment is something you expect a return on, Richard. Jewelry is meant to be worn, to be loved." She felt a familiar, weary pang. He spoke of gems the way he spoke of stocks, of acquisitions. All value, no heart. "Of course, my dear, whatever you want." The words were a placating murmur, an automatic response that required no actual thought. A tall figure emerged from the back office, moving with a silent grace that belied his solid frame. Julian Croft. His family had been jewelers to her family for 3 generations. He had dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing and hands that could coax brilliance from the dullest stone. He wasn't just a merchant, he was an artist, a guardian of heirlooms and secrets. "The Pemberton sapphire, Mrs. Vance," Julian said, his voice a low counterpoint to Richard's polished tones. He placed a velvet tray on the counter. In its center lay a necklace, a single staggering sapphire cut in a perfect teardrop, suspended from a delicate chain of white gold and diamonds. It seemed to drink the light from the room and hold it captive. "I thought it might speak to you." Eleanor's breath caught. It was magnificent. It wasn't just a stone, it was a story, a promise of depth and loyalty. Everything her marriage felt like it was lacking. She looked at Julian, and for a fleeting moment a silent understanding passed between them. He had known her since they were children, playing hide-and-seek on the sprawling lawns of her grandmother's estate. He remembered the girl who dreamed of adventures, not acquisitions. "Julian, it's perfect," she whispered, her fingers hovering over the gem, afraid to touch it, as if its cold fire might burn her. Richard finally looked up from his phone, a flicker of annoyance crossing his handsome features as he registered the intimacy of the moment he had been excluded from. "Well, if you like it, let's get it." "What's the damage, Croft?" He stood, pulling out his wallet, reducing the moment of beauty to a mere transaction. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The price is irrelevant when the piece has found its rightful owner." He directed his words to Eleanor, his eyes ignoring Richard completely. "Would you like to try it on?" Before Eleanor could answer, the heavy glass door of the showroom chimed, a sharp, intrusive sound in the quiet space. All 3 of them turned. Framed in the doorway was a young woman. She was a blaze of color and sharp angles in the muted elegance of the shop. Her dress was a shade of red that screamed for attention, tight and short. Her hair was a platinum blonde so bright it looked synthetic, and her lips were painted in a matching, aggressive slash of crimson. Her eyes, however, were what held them. They were wide, furious, and fixed on one person. Not on Richard, but on Eleanor. Richard froze, the color drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, sickly pallor. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, or worse, a reality he could no longer escape. He made a small, choked sound. The young woman, Chloe Sterling, took a step forward, her heels clicking like gunshots on the marble floor. "Well, well," she said, her voice dripping with a venom that was shockingly loud in the silent room. "Shopping for your anniversary? How sweet. I hope you're getting her something nice, Ricky, something to make up for all the nights you've been spending with me." The silence that followed Chloe's announcement was a physical thing, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed down on them all. Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs, not in a gasp, but in a slow, silent release, as if a string inside her had been cut. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't need to. The sudden, clammy coldness in the room, the scent of his fear, was confirmation enough. She kept her eyes on the sapphire, that perfect, deep blue stone. It seemed to pulse with a cold, ancient light, a world away from the cheap, sordid drama unfolding behind her. Julian Croft stood perfectly still behind the counter, his posture unchanged. Yet Eleanor, who had known him her whole life, saw the shift. His shoulders, though relaxed, seemed broader. His hands, resting on the velvet tray, were steady, but his knuckles were white. He was a statue of coiled stillness, a predator waiting. It was Richard who broke the silence, his voice a desperate, cracking whisper. "Chloe, what are you doing here? This is not the time or the place." Chloe let out a laugh, a harsh, ugly sound that grated against the refined quiet of the showroom. "Not the time? Oh, I think it's the perfect time. You told me you were ending it. You told me last night, in my bed, that you were finally going to tell your fragile, pathetic wife about us." She took another step, her eyes, burning with a furious, possessive light, raking over Eleanor from head to toe. She took in the simple, impeccably tailored cashmere dress, the single strand of pearls at her neck, the quiet grace that clung to her like a second skin. It was everything Chloe was not, and her contempt was palpable. "So this is her," Chloe sneered, gesturing at Eleanor as if she were a piece of furniture. "The Ice Queen, the great Eleanor Vance. You know, he told me all about you, how cold you are, how you haven't really touched him in years. He says being with you is like sleeping next to a beautiful, expensive statue." Each word was a carefully sharpened dart, aimed to wound and humiliate. Eleanor felt a tremor start deep inside her, a cold rage that was entirely unfamiliar. But on the surface, she remained still. She had been raised to believe that public displays of emotion were a sign of poor breeding. Crying, screaming, fighting. That was for other people. Vances endured. They weathered storms with quiet dignity. She finally turned her head, slowly, and looked at her husband. Richard wouldn't meet her gaze. His eyes darted around the room, anywhere but at her or his mistress. He looked trapped, a cornered animal stripped of its power and prestige. In that moment, she didn't feel hatred for him, or even betrayal. She felt a profound, bottomless pity. He was so weak. "Richard," Eleanor said, her voice astoundingly calm, clear as a bell, "is this woman telling the truth?" He flinched at the directness of her question. He stammered, his usual eloquence deserting him entirely. "Eleanor, it's complicated. She's twisting things." "Oh, I'm twisting things," Chloe shrieked, advancing further until she was standing right beside Richard, her hand possessively on his arm. He didn't shake it off. "I'll show you twisting things, you spineless liar." She fumbled in her purse, her movements jerky with rage, and pulled out her phone. She jabbed at the screen. "He told me he loved me. He was going to leave you for me. We were picking out a house." She shoved the phone towards Eleanor's face. On the screen were dozens of text messages, saccharine and sordid. "My beautiful girl, can't wait to hold you. This life with her is a prison. Soon it will just be us." Eleanor didn't read them. She didn't need to. The truth was a physical presence in the room now, undeniable and ugly. She simply looked past the phone, at Chloe's face, contorted with a desperate, frantic rage, and she saw not a monster, but another victim. A foolish, loud, and vulgar victim, but a victim nonetheless. A woman who had believed the empty promises of a weak man. "You can have him," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of finality. "If a man like this is what you want, he is all yours." Chloe stared, momentarily stunned by the lack of hysterics, the absence of tears or shouting. She had come expecting a fight, a satisfying, dramatic scene. Eleanor's cold composure was more insulting than any slap could have been. It denied her the power she craved. "You think you're so much better than me, don't you?" Chloe's voice dropped to a low, trembling hiss. "With your perfect clothes, and your perfect family, and your perfect cold heart. You think you can just dismiss me?" "I am not dismissing you," Eleanor replied, her gaze unwavering. "I am dismissing him." She finally turned her full attention to Richard. "Our marriage is over. You can leave, both of you. Leave this shop. Now." Richard looked stunned, as if the possibility of her ending things had never once crossed his mind. "Eleanor, don't be ridiculous. We can talk about this at home." "There is no we anymore," Eleanor stated. and there is no home for you to come back to. That was the final straw for Chloe. The sight of Eleanor, not broken but empowered, making decisions and ending the life Chloe so desperately wanted to be a part of, sent her over the edge. All the frustration, all the humiliation, all the fury at being played by Richard and dismissed by his wife, coalesced into a single violent impulse. "You bitch!" she screamed, her face a mask of pure hatred. She lunged forward, her arm swinging back, her hand with its long, red-painted nails open and ready to strike Eleanor across the face. Time seemed to slow, to stretch like taffy. Eleanor saw the motion, the blur of red fabric and the flash of rage in Chloe's eyes. She saw the hand coming, the sharp, manicured nails aimed for her cheek. She braced herself for the impact, for the sting, for the public humiliation she had spent her entire life avoiding. Her dignity, the only armor she had left, was about to be stripped away. But the blow never landed. In the fraction of a second between Chloe's lunge and the intended impact, a dark shape moved with impossible speed. It was Julian. He had vaulted over the low, velvet-roped barrier, separating the main floor from his private consultation area as if it weren't there. He moved not like a jeweler, but like a panther, all silent, fluid power. His left hand shot out and caught Chloe's wrist mid-swing, his fingers wrapping around the delicate bones with the unyielding strength of a vice. Her forward momentum was stopped so abruptly she let out a choked gasp. But he didn't stop there. His right hand followed an instant later. It wasn't a grab or a shove, it was a precise, controlled movement. His fingers, long and strong from decades of intricate work with metal and stone, closed around Chloe Sterling's throat. He didn't squeeze to choke, but to control. With a single, seemingly effortless motion, fueled by a cold, contained fury, he lifted. Chloe's feet left the floor. She was suspended in the air, dangling from his grip, her expensive heels kicking uselessly inches above the polished marble. Her eyes bulged, a mixture of shock, terror, and disbelief. The scream she had been about to unleash died in her throat, replaced by a series of pathetic, strangled squeaks. The garish red of her dress was a flag of surrender against the dark, impeccable tailoring of Julian's suit. The showroom was plunged into a silence so profound it was almost deafening. The only sound was the frantic, panicked rasp of Chloe's breathing. Richard stood frozen, his mouth agape, his face was a canvas of pathetic indecision. He looked from his gasping mistress to the terrifyingly calm jeweler holding her aloft, to his wife, who stood, untouched, behind the shield of Julian's body. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to move, how to speak, how to think. Julian's face was a mask of cold, lethal rage. His dark eyes were fixed on Chloe's, and they held no pity, no hesitation. "You will not lay a hand on her," he said, his voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. It was not the voice of a man who sold precious stones. It was the voice of a man who would break bones without a second thought. "Not in my shop, not ever." He held her there for a long, terrifying moment, letting the reality of her situation sink in, letting the absolute certainty of his threat brand itself into her mind. Then, with a flick of his wrist, as if discarding a piece of trash, he dropped her. Chloe crumpled to the floor in a heap of red silk and flailing limbs, landing with a painful-sounding thud. She immediately scrambled backward on her hands and knees, crab-walking away from him, her face pale with terror. She coughed and sputtered, her hand clutching her throat, the marks of his fingers already beginning to blossom on her pale skin. Julian didn't even glance at her. He straightened his suit jacket with a small, precise tug and turned to face Richard. His eyes, which had been blazing with fury, were now chips of ice. "And you," Julian said, his voice dropping even lower, laced with a contempt that was more chilling than his anger. "You brought this filth into my place of business. You brought this filth to her." Richard finally found his voice, though it was a weak, reedy thing. "Now see here, Croft. You can't assault my guest." Julian took a slow, deliberate step towards him. Richard, for all his boardroom bluster, instinctively took a step back, his bravado crumbling in the face of true physical menace. "Your guest?" Julian's laugh was a short, sharp bark devoid of humor. "You think you have any right to stand here and call anyone your guest? You think you have any rights at all in this room?" He took another step, backing Richard towards the display cases. "You don't know who I am, do you, Vance? After all these years, you still have no idea." Eleanor watched, her own shock momentarily forgotten, replaced by a dawning, stunning realization. Julian wasn't just the family jeweler. He wasn't just a childhood friend. The ferocity of his protection, the primal, possessive way he had defended her, went beyond friendship. It was something deeper, something familial. "You married her," Julian continued, his voice a venomous whisper, "and you never even bothered to learn about her family, her real family." He stopped directly in front of Richard, who was now pressed against the glass case full of diamond rings, symbols of promises he had so casually broken. "Eleanor's mother was married once before she met your father," Julian said, his words dropping like stones into the silent room. "A brief, passionate marriage to a man your world would have considered unsuitable, a sculptor, an artist. They had a son. When the marriage ended and she was groomed to marry into the Vance dynasty, the boy was quietly sent to live with his father's family, the Crofts." He leaned in closer, his face inches from Richard's. "My name is Julian Croft, but my mother's name was Elizabeth. Just like Eleanor's. She was my half-sister, and I have spent my entire life watching out for her, cleaning up the messes of weak, pathetic men like you." The revelation hung in the air, heavier and more brilliant than any diamond in the shop. Julian and Eleanor, brother and sister, the secret, kept for a lifetime, was now laid bare on the marble floor alongside the crumpled form of Richard's mistress. Eleanor stared at Julian, seeing him for the first time, not as a friend, but as blood. The fierce, overprotective glint she'd occasionally seen in his eyes, the way he'd always seemed to know what she was thinking, the quiet disapproval he'd held for Richard from the very beginning, it all snapped into place with the force of a physical blow. Her mother, Elizabeth, had always been a figure of quiet sorrows and unspoken histories. Eleanor had known there was a past, a life before the Vances, but it was a locked room she had never been given the key to. Now the door had been kicked open. Julian, her brother. The word felt strange and wonderful on her tongue, though she hadn't spoken it. Richard's face was a mess of confusion and dawning horror. He looked from Julian to Eleanor and back again, his mind so adept at financial calculations and strategic takeovers, struggling to process this deeply personal human equation. "Brother, that's impossible. Her family is more complicated than your shallow understanding of lineage can comprehend," Julian cut in, his voice like chipping stone. "We kept it quiet to protect her, to protect our mother's memory from the judgment of your insipid social circle, but protection has its limits, and my patience for you ran out about 10 years ago." He straightened up, creating a space between them, but his dominance over Richard was absolute. "I know everything, Vance. I know about the bad investments you hid from her, using her inheritance as collateral without her knowledge. I know about the business trips that were nothing more than sordid little getaways. I know you've been systematically isolating her from her old friends, anyone who might have seen you for the parasite you are. I have watched you, and I have waited. I was waiting for her to be ready to see it for herself." He gestured with his chin towards Chloe, who was now shakily getting to her feet. Mascara streaked down her face, her bravado completely shattered. "And today, you were stupid enough to bring the evidence right to my door." Chloe, seeing her opportunity to escape, scurried towards the entrance, casting one last terrified, hateful look at the scene. She fumbled with the heavy glass door and then was gone, a flash of red disappearing onto the street, leaving the wreckage of her own making behind. Now it was just the three of them, the wife, the husband, and the brother, the tableau of a failed marriage. For the first time since Chloe's arrival, Eleanor spoke to Julian. "You knew," she said, her voice soft but filled with a universe of meaning. "You knew he was unfaithful." Julian turned to her, and the cold fury in his eyes melted away, replaced by a deep, aching sadness and a profound affection. "I suspected," he said gently. "I didn't have proof until recently. I hired a private investigator a month ago. I couldn't stand to watch you fade away anymore, Ellie. You've been living like a ghost in your own life." Ellie. The name no one had called her since she was a girl, running barefoot through her grandmother's gardens. Hearing it from him now, in this context, felt like coming home. The use of the childhood nickname seemed to finally break the dam of her composure. A single perfect tear traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness for her marriage, but of release. It was a tear for the years of quiet loneliness, for the girl she had been, and for the brother she never knew she had. She walked past Richard as if he were invisible. She stopped in front of Julian and without a word reached out and placed her hand on his chest. She could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath her palm. "Thank you," she whispered. It was for everything, for stopping the slap, for telling the truth, for being there all along, a silent guardian in the shadows of her life. Richard finally seemed to grasp the totality of his ruin. He wasn't just losing his wife. He was being exposed, utterly and completely, in front of a man who held a power over his family he had never imagined. His weakness had been laid bare. "Eleanor, please," he pleaded, his voice taking on a desperate, wheedling tone. "We can't throw away 15 years over this mistake. Think of our lives, our reputation." Eleanor turned slowly, her expression now clear and hard as the sapphire on the counter. The tear was gone, and in its place was a resolve forged in the fires of that afternoon. "Our reputation?" she asked, a small, incredulous laugh escaping her lips. "You are worried about your reputation. You stood there, Richard. You stood there and you were going to let that woman strike me. You stood there while she insulted me, while she aired our private life for a stranger to hear. You did nothing. You said nothing." She took a step towards him, and for the first time in their marriage, he flinched away from her. "It wasn't Julian who destroyed our marriage. It wasn't Chloe. It was you, your weakness, your lies, your cowardice." She walked to the counter and looked down at the Pemberton sapphire. It glowed with a fierce, independent light. It was a survivor, formed under immense pressure deep within the earth. She felt a kinship with it. "I believe this transaction is complete," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. She looked at Julian. "Send the bill to my personal account, not his." Then she turned back to Richard, her eyes cold and final. "Have your things out of my house by the end of the day. My lawyer will be in contact with yours tomorrow morning. And Richard," she added, as he stood there utterly defeated, "if you ever try to speak to me again, you will be speaking to my brother first." She left him there, a broken man in a room full of priceless things he could no longer afford, standing beside a brother he never knew existed. Eleanor walked out of the shop, not looking back, the bell on the door chiming her departure not as an ending, but as the beginning of everything else. The days that followed were a whirlwind of structured demolition. The meeting with the lawyers was a masterclass in controlled fire. They convened in a sterile, glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor. The city spread out below them like a map of a kingdom about to be redrawn. Richard arrived flanked by 2 aggressive attorneys, his face a mask of aggrieved confidence. He'd had 48 hours to rebuild his narrative, casting himself as the magnanimous husband, wounded by his wife's irrationality. "My client is prepared to be generous in the settlement," his lead counsel began, his voice oozing condescension, considering Mrs. Vance's understandable but overwrought emotional state following the unfortunate incident in Mr. Croft's establishment. Eleanor's lawyer, a razor-sharp woman named Anne Albright, whose severe spectacles seemed to magnify the intensity of her gaze, offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Generosity isn't on the table, gentlemen. We're here to discuss asset recovery." She slid a thick binder across the polished mahogany table. It landed with a heavy final thud that made Richard jump. Exhibit A, the unauthorized leveraging of the Vance family trust, Eleanor's trust, as collateral for a failed commodities venture in Singapore. A venture you told her had been funded by your own firm. Richard's confident expression faltered. "That's a business misunderstanding. A temporary liquidity measure." "Is it?" Albright cut in, her voice like chipping ice. "Because the bank doesn't see it that way, nor does the SEC, I imagine." Then we have Exhibit B, the sale of her grandmother's art collection, which you claimed went to pay estate taxes. Odd, since those taxes were paid from a different account 6 months prior. The proceeds, it seems, were wired to an offshore account in the Caymans. She paused, letting the words sink in. An account which, coincidentally, funded the down payment on a penthouse apartment for one Chloe Sterling. Richard's face had gone from pale to a sickly grey. He stared at Eleanor, who sat silently at Albright's side, her gaze calm and steady. He was looking for a flicker of doubt, of the old, accommodating Eleanor. He found nothing but glacial resolve. He saw not the wife he had taken for granted, but a stranger, a creature of cold, meticulous fury. The following spring, the sign above the elegant shop was changed. The old, discreet brass plate that read Croft & Co. was replaced by a newly forged one, Croft & Vance. Eleanor had poured her life and a significant portion of her reclaimed inheritance into the partnership. She unearthed a talent she'd long suppressed, a deep academic knowledge of gemology and historical jewelry, a passion Richard had dismissed as a cute little hobby. Now it was her weapon. Her meticulous attention to detail, honed by years of studying inclusions in emeralds and the provenance of royal pearls, was now turned to financial statements and legal documents. She became the face of the business, her quiet elegance and sharp intellect a perfect counterpoint to Julian's artistic soul. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, the city's social season culminated in the annual Heritage Foundation Gala. It was Richard's last redoubt, the one place his name still carried a sliver of its former weight. He was clinging to his seat on the board, and he intended to use his keynote address as a platform for his own resurrection. Eleanor arrived with Julian, a vision in a gown of midnight blue that matched the Pemberton sapphire at her throat. The gem seemed to pulse with a calm, cold fire. A hush fell as they entered the grand ballroom, the chatter of 100 conversations dipping as heads turned. She saw the looks, pity from some, morbid curiosity from most. She met them all with a serene, unreadable gaze. Richard was across the room, a shark in a tuxedo, surrounded by the few allies he had left. He looked thinner, a haunted quality around his eyes, but his smile was the same predatory slash. When he saw her, his eyes narrowed, a flare of pure hatred in their depths. Her survival was his deepest insult. The lights dimmed. The Foundation's president introduced Richard with a strained, overly formal speech. Richard strode to the podium, basking in the spotlight, the mask of charming confidence sliding perfectly into place. "Friends, colleagues," he began, his voice a balm of practiced sincerity. He spoke of legacy, of heritage, of building things that last. Then his tone shifted, becoming somber, confessional. "As many of you know, this has been a challenging year, a time of profound personal loss. Sometimes, in life, great structures are torn down. Marriages, businesses, reputations." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on Eleanor, a look of noble suffering etched on his face. "Often by forces beyond our control, by misunderstandings, by the tragic consequences of emotional volatility." A gasp rippled through the room. It was a declaration of war. He was painting her as a hysterical woman who had ruined him. Richard warmed to his theme. "But character, true character, is forged in fire. It is about resilience. It is about rebuilding. It is about refusing to let bitterness and greed destroy the foundations of our community. We must have faith that the truth will always prevail over slander and opportunism." He was about to launch into his grand conclusion when a clear voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Vance, may I ask a question?" All heads swiveled. Eleanor was on her feet, her expression placid. A second spotlight found her, pinning her in a circle of light. They were actors on a stage, the crowd their silent jury. Richard's face tightened. "Eleanor, this is hardly the time." "On the contrary," she said, her voice amplified by the room's perfect acoustics. "You speak of legacy. I couldn't agree more. Which is why I am so curious about the legacy of a particular charity you personally managed, the Eleanor Vance Literacy Fund. The one named after my grandmother." A nervous murmur spread. Richard's smile was a rictus of forced calm. "That fund's work is a matter of public record." "Indeed," Eleanor agreed pleasantly. "And my forensic accountant, Ms. Albright," she gestured to the same severe-looking woman at her table who gave a curt nod, "found the public record fascinating, especially the invoices from a shell corporation, Sterling Imports, For consulting services, over $200,000 last year alone. Richard's face went from pale to ashen. His knuckles were white where he gripped the podium. These are baseless accusations, a private matter being twisted by a bitter... Are they? Eleanor's voice was like ice, cutting through his bluster. Because Sterling is the last name of your former mistress, is it not? The one for whom you purchased a penthouse with funds embezzled from a children's charity. Were those consulting services rendered in the boardroom, Richard, or the bedroom? The silence was a physical blow. Somewhere in the room, a champagne flute shattered on the marble floor. You see, Eleanor continued, taking a slow step forward, you thought the scene in the jewelry shop was my humiliation. You misunderstood. It wasn't a humiliation. It was a declaration. This was the twist, the truth she and Julian had held back, the final killing blow. Julian's investigator wasn't hired a month before our marriage ended. He was hired a full year before. I knew Richard. I knew about Chloe. And about the flight attendant in Geneva. And the real estate agent in Palm Beach. I knew you were leveraging my family's trust to cover your catastrophic market gambles. I knew everything. Her eyes locked on his. He was transfixed, a rabbit in the headlights of his own destruction. I didn't stay because I was weak. I stayed to gather the evidence. I stayed while Ms. Albright traced every dollar you stole from me and from my grandmother's charity. I stayed to build a case so airtight that when I finally chose to leave, you would have nothing. That scene in the shop wasn't the cause of our divorce, it was the closing argument. You were so arrogant you thought you were playing me, but Richard, you were the final predictable move in a game you didn't even know had begun. She let the words hang in the air, a public execution. You speak of legacy. Your legacy will be that of a common thief who stole from children. You didn't just lose your wife. Tonight, you have lost the only thing you ever truly cared about. Your name. And tomorrow morning, when the district attorney unseals the indictment Ms. Albright filed last week, you will lose your freedom as well. Richard stood there, mute, trembling. The mask of charm had shattered, revealing the weak, terrified man beneath. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The Foundation's president was already on his feet, his face a mask of thunderous fury, walking towards the stage. Eleanor turned without another glance at him and walked back to her table. Julian stood, his expression a mixture of fierce pride and profound love, and pulled out her chair. The room erupted in a horrified buzz. Men who had clapped Richard on the back an hour earlier now stared at him with contempt, their wives pulling them away as if he were contagious. They left the gala, the sounds of Richard's public vivisection fading behind them. In the cool night air, Julian took her hand. Are you all right, Ellie? She looked up at the star-filled sky, taking her first breath as a truly free woman. Julian, she said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face, I have never been better. A year later, they sat on a weathered bench at her family's old seaside estate, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The salt-laced wind whipped a loose strand of hair across her face. The sign for Croft and Vance was now a symbol of rebirth in the city. Was it worth the cost? Julian asked softly. That year of silence. Of knowing. Eleanor watched a wave crash against the shore, the foam glowing in the twilight. I regret the person I had to become to survive him, she said, her voice thoughtful. The suspicion, the calculation. The woman who had to smile at her husband at dinner, knowing he'd spent the afternoon with another woman and the morning stealing from a trust. That was the hardest part. The performance. She turned to him, her eyes clear. But I don't regret the fight. He mistook my quiet for weakness. He mistook my endurance for complicity. He never understood that silence can also be a blade being sharpened. He underestimated you, Julian said. Everyone did. The real victory wasn't watching him fall at the gala, she mused. That was just an ending. The beginning was the day I walked into your office, a year before all that, and said, I think my husband is a thief, and I need my brother's help to prove it. He smiled, the setting sun catching the silver at his temples. It was the day my sister took back her crown. They sat in comfortable silence as the last sliver of sun disappeared. At her throat, the Pemberton sapphire seemed to gather the fading light, holding a deep, calm, and inextinguishable glow. It was no longer just a jewel. It was an anchor, a weapon, a testament. It was a reminder that the most precious things are not those that are bought, but those that are reclaimed. Like, share, and comment your thoughts on this ending.